such a pleasure to see so many people here today at our book talk, both old and new faces alike. My name is Leora Eisenberg. I am a fourth-year PhD student in Soviet Central Asian history here at Harvard. And I'm very closely affiliated with the program on Central Asia at the Davis Center, which has kindly sponsored this event. We're very, very, very lucky to have Professor Masha Salazkina with us today, who will be telling us about her new book, Global Socialist Cinema, Alliances, Affinities, and Solidarities in the Global Cold War. I will go ahead and introduce Professor Salazkina, and after I do that, I will then hand off the floor to her. She'll speak for about 30 or so minutes, 30, 40 minutes, and then we'll move into Q&A, which I will moderate. I'll probably ask one or two questions to get things moving, and then I hope that you will take over the floor with your surely very interesting questions. Professor Salazkina is a professor of film and moving image studies at Concordia University in Montreal. Her first book in Access, Sergei Eisenstein's Morocco tells you where my head has been going. Mexico reconstructs the transcontinental legacies of Soviet revolutionary avant-gardes of the 1920s through 1930s. World Socialist Cinema, Alliances, Affinities, and Solidarities in the Global Cold War, which we'll be discussing today, takes the Tashkent Festival of Cinemas of Asia, Africa, and Latin America as an aperture into the investigation of both material networks and symbolic forms that were shared across pro-socialist Cold War film cultures globally in the 1960s through 70s. Her most recent book, Romancing Yesenia, How a Mexican Melodrama Shaped Global Popular Culture, focuses on the production, international distribution, and reception of the highest grossing movie in the history of Soviet film exhibition, the Mexican historical melodrama Yesenia from 1971, offering a transnational and comparative analysis of women's cultures in the 1970s Soviet Union and Mexico. And with that, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Leora. Hello, everyone. Thank you for this invitation to talk about my book and for this chance to revisit the history of the Tashkent Festival of Cinemas of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. I'm going to start by sharing my slides. Let's see. Can everyone see?
You can see your slides.
All right, thank you. So I would like to start right away by acknowledging the debt that I have to friends and collaborators who had helped me tremendously with the research on this book, providing me with crucial archival material as well as invaluable feedback. And I will actually talk about sort of how the book both came about and the different ideas for the shape that it could have taken. And really, the original idea was a collaborative one, and we were a group of scholars that included Rosen Jagalov and Yelena Razlogova wanting to work on this history. As I wrote this book entirely during the pandemic, my own ability to travel at that time and the combined pressures of work and childcare basically enabled me paradoxically to undertake this project as a single-authored book by just accepting the built-in limitations and working with what was at hand, rather than continuing with years and years of what could have potentially been a much more expansive project. But really, it was meant to be just an act of translation and an introduction intended to lay out the groundwork for others to take this up as an invitation to work on this history further. And I am delighted to see that after the publication of my book, which is now almost 2 years ago, there has been further research on the festival, both various forms of collaborative research, such as this very recent book that came out of two events, one that took place in Tashkent, the other one in Berlin, Destination Tashkent, that I really urge everyone to get, and I hope the Harvard Library buys it too, as well as the work of some of my younger colleagues, scholars like Furkat Palvanzadeh, and here just a shout out to a recent article that Furkat published just this winter that also deals with Tashkent, framing it in relation to the more contemporary developments on the European art scene. But my initial interest in the history of the Tashkent Festival was as a film historian, working in a somewhat murky area of world cinema, and on the history of film festivals more generally. And one simple reason why I was absolutely stunned both to learn about the Tashkent Festival and to kind of reckon with the fact that I had not heard of that festival in the many years that I studied history of cinema, either as an undergraduate or as a graduate student, was the simple fact that from the late 1960s to at least the mid 1980s, this festival was simply the venue in which one can see the largest number and widest variety of films representing the world beyond Europe and North America. And the figures cited in Soviet media, which is most of the access that we have to these statistics, are indeed impressive, even if from our contemporary oversaturated media perspective, it may be hard to appreciate just how unique and unusual such cinematic geography was for the festivals of the time. So at the first festival already, you had 49 countries of Asia and Africa represented. By 72, that number went up to 61 countries of Asia and Africa. And then by 1976, when Latin America was included in this broader geography, you had 109 countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America represented. Again, there was simply no other festival in the world where you could see this broad a range of cinematic production, again, beyond Europe and the United States or North America. And yet these numbers still do little to give us an idea of Tashkent Festival's uniqueness. Taking place over the course of a week, every 2 years, with all screenings open to public, the festival's goal was to showcase as many types of cinematic expressions from Asia, Africa, and Latin America as the participating countries were willing or able to offer. The only countries to which the festival did not extend invitation were South Africa, Israel, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. China was invited, but never participated, leaving all other nations of Asia, Africa, and after 1974, Latin America, sending in their film selections, which combined fiction films with documentary and animation, mixing combat documentaries shot on location in the hotspots of the global Cold War with lavish musical melodramas, institutional nonfiction, such as newsreels, travelogues, industrial and educational films, with militant independent productions. And this snapshot just gives you a sense of this variety, because you see here some actresses, but also Med Hondo from Mauritania, who was one of the most important anti-colonial avant-gardist filmmaker from France and Mauritania. So a really unusual combination of, again, politically avant-garde films with basically commercial cinema, for example, here from Mexico, Nepal, as well as the Soviet Republic of Georgia. So the scale of the festival program is quite remarkable, but so is the fact that this type of selection stood very much apart from all the developments at the international film festival circuit of the time, where the promotion of individual cinematic auteurs was gradually becoming the norm during exactly that period in the late 60s and early 70s, and solidifying in the film festival circuit, especially in Europe, this specific criteria of how we now think of art cinema as festival cinema. So here instead, you had a very different constellation of genres as well. So many of the cinematic categories included at Tashkent, such as commercial genre films, for example, Indian popular films, would not have been shown at the European festival circuit just because, again, they represented popular genre cinema. Others, such as industrial, ethnographic, or educational nonfiction film, would be designated their own specialized festivals. And there were certainly specialized festivals of, let's say, travel or even, industrial documentaries, but they wouldn't be included in a regular festival, let's say Venice, Berlin, or any of the others. At Tashkent, instead of reinforcing the continuously widening political aesthetic division between commercial, state-produced, and independent cinemas, which really characterizes the 1970s, here populist Raj Kapoor shared space and screen time with the modernist Mrinal Sen, avant-gardist Med Hondo with old-fashioned realists like Tawfiq Saleh or Yamamoto Satsuo, and PLO combat films were shown alongside UNESCO-produced ethnographic documentaries. One of the participants of the first 1968 festival was Silang Chen, who was the wife of Jaylaida, a famous Soviet film historian who was educated at GIK in the 1930s. And in her memoirs written in the 1980s, Chen recalls her experience of attending the festival, comparing it to the Moscow Film Festival, which she says was, I quote, not greatly different from all others. She highlights instead Tashkent's unique festival character. She says all of it was out of the ordinary. She briefly mentions the surprises among the screenings, such as, for example, Usman Samben's films that really came to fore at the first screenings of the festival. But then her recollection centers on a different aspect of the festival, on the receptions, where, I quote, amidst lots of wine and food, everyone was dancing, end quote. There, Chen was delighted to reunite with her former teacher, Tamara Hanum, a celebrated Armenian Uzbek performer and musician who was part of the festival's jury. Chen's recollection captured the thrill of spontaneity in the midst of what was surely a highly choreographed event, as she describes how at the closing reception held at the Uzbek Film Studio, I quote, the skilled drumming caught me up in the excitement of the occasion. I jumped onto the stage. The drummers got even more excited, and I was dancing my Uzbek dance again, end quote. Sino-Trinidadian dancer and political activist, Chen was the daughter of the leftist first foreign minister of Republican China, who was exiled to the Soviet Union with his family in the 1920s. It was in Moscow that she began her dancing career and met her future husband, Jaylaida, in 1933. And this was soon after her passionate affair with Langston Hughes, who was in Moscow for the making of a film, Black and White, that project that was never realized. When that failed, Hughes traveled all over the country, spending several months in Uzbekistan. For most non-white foreign visitors as early as the 1930s, Central Asia, or as Hughes himself referred to it, USSR's own, I quote, dusty-colored cotton-growing South, end quote, was both a showcase and a test of the racial equality in the new Soviet Union, attracting much interest and attention. Chen herself spent time in Central Asia just a year prior as part of her dance tour, performing at the Opera Theater in Tashkent, learning Uzbek folk dance from Hanum, who was one of the first women to perform unveiled in Tashkent in the 1920s. Just as an aside, she was an Armenian, so veiling was really not something that she had ever practiced, but she performed on stage, and it was Hughes' writings about her, published in the US Popular Front journal Theater Arts in 1934, that brought Hanum her international recognition. And by the late 1960s, when the first Tashkent Film Festival took place, Hanum, who epitomized the liberation of Soviet Central Asian women, was an important cultural ambassador, having performed abroad in Afghanistan, India, Pakistan, Indonesia, Burma, Vietnam, and many other countries, with a repertoire of songs in 86 languages, as well as a dance repertoire. Chen's own artistic practice and travel trajectories reflected similar commitment as her dance brought together the different facets of her own identity, experience, and ideology. That was at once Caribbean, Chinese, Soviet, and internationalist. And Tashkent Film Festival was in many ways the cinematic equivalent of such a conception of artistic internationalism. So I start my book and today's talk with Chen's brief recollections of the festival because they bring into focus the contours of both the earlier intertwined histories of internationalist solidarities, transracial affinities, personal bonds, institutional connections, multifaceted artistic expressions, and political commitments, and the role that gender played in shaping these histories. These same genealogies were also foundational for this new phase of Soviet efforts to lead cultural internationalism that the Tashkent Festival represented in 1968 and throughout its history. And it is the reach of this vision that the book reconstructs. Without a doubt, it was an exercise in soft power and cultural diplomacy, a tool of Soviet geopolitics. At the same time, the history of the festival provides us with an aperture into a broader cinematic culture that was shared across Asia, Africa, and Latin America in the 1960s and 70s, thus placing Tashkent in relation to sites of exchanges beyond the Moscow-centered Soviet sphere, in an effort to construct a transnational history of cinema of that period, as rooted in experiences and cinematic forms outside of what we now call the global north, and that would include Europe or North America, but also, again, a Russo or Moscow-centered vision of Soviet cinema. Chen's perspective also allows us a glimpse into a more ineffable aspect of this history, the unmistakable gendering of artistic and intellectual spheres, the peculiar blurring of official staging of cultural diplomacy with joyful spontaneity and powerful affective bonds, as well as unexpected cinematic juxtapositions, blending names and titles that are very familiar to most contemporary film scholars and film lovers with those whose very existence have been largely written out of mainstream cinematic histories. As my book reconstructs the geopolitical and artistic networks that the festival engaged, as well as the shared cinematic forms it promoted, it also seeks to attend to the effective affinities and ambiguities, contradictions, and erasures that were all equally constitutive of this history of global cinema culture that I refer to as world socialist cinema. The festival was not an entirely unique or isolated phenomenon, existing as part of the broader network of festivals and other film-centered events across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, which similarly fall outside of the traditional accounts of either festival studies or film history at large. And here you have a kind of a snapshot of the important festivals from the 50s, 60s, and 70s that Tashkent was really a part of. And in many cases, the connections were very direct. And for example, the Carthage Film Festival in Tunisia really was a very important kind of sister festival to Tashkent, to the point where in 1968 there was actually a charter flight that was taking filmmakers and critics from Tunisia to Tashkent. And the scheduling of the festival from its 1972 edition on was done very carefully so that not to create conflicts with these festivals. The sheer quantity and variety of invitees and participants from the film cultures around the world created a fascinating instability of the various hegemonies that were at play at an event like this. And I argue that the shared sphere is irreducible to North, South, East, West, Orientalist, or Cold War binaries, producing a different situated notions of humanist universalism, which at times overlapped with the notion of socialist internationalism, other times it overlapped with the third worldist ideas and non-aligned movement imaginaries, and other times deviated or completely departed from either of those. Engaging with this history allows us to reconstruct a different geography of knowledge, one that resists both the Anglo-Atlantic Eurocentric canon of history or area studies, compartmentalization, and kind of imaginaries of kind of privileged and isolated histories of specific areas. Placing cinematic production that constituted these networks in relation to each other, therefore, produces a powerful shared body of work, of cinematic work in particular, through which to explore the cultural and political dynamics of that era. And the strands of this shared body of work are already visible in the first edition. The intertwined agendas of post-colonial national heritage, internationalist, anti-imperialist solidarity, and at the same time, commercial and popular audience preferences. And it will shape not only the history of Tashkent Festival, but I will argue be paradigmatic for world socialist cinema that crystallizes around it. Thus, after reconstructing the broader history of the festival in the book, and I start by discussing the programming at the first two editions in 1968 and then in the early 1970s, as well as the discourses and lived experiences, and that's mostly concentrating in chapter 3. The concluding chapters of my book try to offer some conceptual contours of the main constitutive problematics that shape what I term world socialist cinema, the cinema that collectively emerges from all the body of cinematic work that was shown at Tashkent, that reproduces the cultural logic of socialism in a way that allowed for the alliances, affinities, and solidarities that I allude to in the title of my book. So I identify three major problematics that kind of emerged as through lines across these cinemas, again, across the cinemas of Central Asia, but also of Asia, Africa, and Latin America at large, films with a socialist orientation. One is cinema of industrial modernization and development. And here in the book, I take as an example, on the one hand, a Syrian film by Amar Amiraleh, Filmesi on the Euphrates Dam, that was made in Syria in 1970. And I contrast it with the history of the making of the Egyptian Soviet co-production directed by Youssef Chahine in 1968 that actually failed and had to be reshot in 1972, the film that was variously known as The People on the Nile, while One Day on the Nile, Once the Nile. The other topic that I focus on in chapter 7 is what I refer to as cinema of world cultural heritage. And here the book focuses on the one hand, a Uzbek film made a biopic of Al-Biruni, and on the other hand, a series of films made at the Tajik film studio by Boris Kimigerov that are all based on the Shahnameh. And they explore the complex constructions of different imaginaries of past communities, kind of pan-Asian at large imaginaries, and the way that these films negotiate different conceptions of world cultural heritage across the various national, liberal, post-colonial, and socialist internationalist framework. Then the concluding chapter of the book discusses cinema of armed struggle as constitutive of the Cold War discourse on peace within global socialism. And here, after a brief discussion of Soviet reception of Japanese leftists' anti-war commemorations of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the iconography of Vietnamese revolutionary cinemas, which all formed part of the program at the Tashkent Festival, I do a close reading of a documentary detailing the liberation war of Bangladesh, made by a communist-affiliated filmmaker, Zahir Raihan. Now, in addition to these three dominant themes, the book also focuses on the overlapping discourses on the woman's question and their reflection in cinematic, socialist, and third world spheres as offering a particular alternative to Western liberal feminism. And so chapter 4 examines, on the one hand, the gender dynamic of the festival itself. So the importance of women's liberation as a thematic concern and the construction of female stars as cultural ambassadors on the one hand, and a glaring absence of female directors and critics on the other, embodied yet another internal contradiction of this Tashkent cultural sphere. And here we really have to turn to festival publicity and documentation with images and newsreels to make sense of the gendering and racialization of that period. And one sees a lot of older men in suits, and these are mostly the Soviet and Asian directors and functionaries, younger men in suits, but with considerably longer hair and often beards and mustaches. And these tend to be Latin American and North African leftist directors, Black men in colorful tunics, and these are mostly sub-Saharan African filmmakers. And typically, they are surrounded by attractive young women dressed in colorful national costumes or fashionable attire. And often the two are combined, because we're also looking at the period of the 1970s, where you really have the emergence of, on the one hand, the kind of pride in national dress emerging in various post-colonial contexts, but also the ethno-chic and the boho style that becomes typical for international fashion, generally speaking. Right. And so many of these actresses were also singers and dancers, and they become regular participants of the festival as well, forming long-lasting friendships with the Soviet filmmakers, critics, and functionaries, and actually playing a strategic role in the organization of the festival and its running. And so, as my references to Silan Chen and Tamara Hanum sort of allude to, and another reason why I wanted to start my talk and the book with them. At the same time, the same chapter also considers an alternative iteration of world socialist cinema from a perspective of women, then offering a discussion of several films made by women directors that were not shown at the festival. I'll just go back to the slide very quickly. So I discuss a film by Larisa Shapitko, Asa Jabar, and Lana Gogoberidze. And I propose that women's cinema was a limit case of world socialist cinema, albeit one largely excluded from the Tashkent Festival circuit, but nonetheless one that is capable of offering a distinct and crucial perspective on the politics of emancipation from that period. So rather than reading from the book or giving you more details, which I'm hoping that you can all find very easily, and the book is available open access, you can download it from the website of California University Press. I wanted just very briefly to touch upon the sort of specificities and the challenges that I faced when writing it in terms of the kind of methodological approaches that I either chose or that sort of I had to opt for. So the obvious challenge was the sheer scope and scale of the project, right? Because as a film scholar and interested primarily in the actual films, the cinematic networks, the histories of the filmmakers, and the cinematic cultures that they represented, given again the scale of the number of films, countries represented, is really a methodological problem in its own right. But this was especially the case with the kinds of cinemas that this project deals with that are largely unknown to all but area studies specialists, right? Very simply put, in my whole education and teaching experience in film studies, until I started on this project, I had never seen a film from Bangladesh, for example. Right? And so that's why initially this was conceived of as a collaborative project. But after several years, actually quite a long time, about 10 years of attempts, it failed as such. And I can talk about why that was the case. In part of it, it had to do with just the difficulty of finding the format that would be able to bring a complex phenomenon like this with many authors to light. But as I ended up writing this book myself, of course, I had to do an enormous amount of just secondary reading in as many languages as I could. I had to make some exclusions. So, for example, despite the actual prevalence of Korean and Mongolian cinema at the festival, my book does not deal with those two specific cinemas simply because, I mean, Korean being North Korean or the Democratic Republic of Korean cinema, simply because I found that there was kind of a limit case of the resources and cross-referencing that I could find in the languages that I was familiar with. Right. I also had to limit the temporal scope, and I basically focused just on the 10 years of the festival's existence from 1968 to 78. That speaks in a way to a very particular historical moment, which also happens to be one that witnesses the rise and fall of third worldism and gives a chance to really look at the festival's role in that. But there is, for example, terrific material that deals with the festival history from the 1980s that I really left behind entirely. And I'm certainly hoping that new scholars and other scholars will pick up on those threads. And then, of course, there's my own positionality, acknowledging my limitations as both an ethnic Russian writing about a festival taking place in Central Asia, as a former Soviet subject talking about socialist internationalism, and as a white, highly privileged member of North American Academy writing about cinemas of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And I've been hyper-cognizant of the various overlapping and divergent economies of knowledge extraction and identity politics at play within a project like that. And the best I could do under the circumstances was to stay vigilant, cognizant of the primacy of the Russian and Soviet perspective, for grounding the role played by the Central Asian cultural actors and the exchanges without speaking for them or on their behalf, and also presenting disagreements and diverging perceptions rather than obscuring them. Decisions when to let my authorial voice dominate, when to recede on the background and try to actually have the existing memoirs and recollections speak for themselves. And it's been, quite frankly, a very, very challenging process as a writing exercise. And then, of course, there's the simple issue of availability of archives, which in itself reflects geopolitical and economic hierarchies that the festival itself discussed so frequently. So, of course, the first step towards the documentation comes from the Soviet archives, Moscow-based archives, because most of the documentation was sent to Moscow and was kept there. The further down the line you go, both within the former Soviet Union, including Uzbekistan, but also especially outside, many times the archives are simply unavailable. There are, of course, whole countries where there are no more archives, either paper archives or cinematic archives, when we have Iraq, Syria, Palestine represented in these festivals. And I assure you that very few of those films are on IMDb. So in terms of trying to do cinematic cross-reference, you're really up against quite particular challenges. And this is where I have to say that I've really benefited from the kind of generosity of the community, international community of scholars and lovers of cinema who would simply trade and share materials, including films, which sometimes people kept at their houses, digitized on their own. So there's a kind of an economy of sharing and a solidarity of its own right that has really fed and nurtured this project in a way that was extremely important to it. And at the same time, there was also always a tension between the kind of material archives, whether they're film archives or paper archives, and the oral accounts and the kind of ephemera, which of course is a big part of working on any event, even a film festival. So I tried as much as I could to look for memoirs, correspondences, oral histories, accounts. Rather than having formal interviews, I did try just to talk to as many people as possible, because one of the things that emerges from trying to reconstruct this history is actually the importance of informal sources of information that do not fit very comfortably into even a traditional interview structure. Gossip, for example, right? And I think a lot of us who work on particular histories that are so charged with affective ephemeral aspects really become more and more aware of both the limitations, but also probably kind of need to rethink of how we think of methodologies, including of oral histories, and again, of their own affective intellectual and political economies that inform our understanding of even phenomena such as gossip, or again, informal sharing of memories, discussion of feelings and attitudes towards past events. And so sometimes, though, those kinds of affective histories were easier to access by just talking to people than the actual archives of the films. Some of these are lost together with the whole archives of their countries and nations. Some of the other films that were shown continue to be watched around the world, in some places as nationalist propaganda, other times as objects of nostalgia, other places as kitsch or object of ridicule, and yet in others as an illustration of communist propaganda and a document of atrocities, and rarely, but sometimes also as a source of political inspiration. And so to me, as time goes on, this cinema that I try to kind of give some sense of the contours continue to present endless moral and political dilemmas whose ongoing relevance urges us to seek an alternative to the epistemic regime of the Cold War, whose political rhetoric is still predominant and whose effects daily impact the rest of the world. And I believe that to do so, we need to continue interrogating this history, but of course, it offers more questions than answers. And I will just stop here. Seems like a good moment to start the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Professor Salazkina. I will get us started, but as I've mentioned already in the chat, I will be monitoring it. So please use the chat function or the Q&A function to ask questions. I will keep an eye on it and I will read them out loud just in case that everybody can hear it. I'll start off with asking a question that I had as I was reading the book, which is how this festival fits in, not into necessarily other film festivals, but into other events, festivals, conferences, and congresses that were held in Tashkent around the same time. So there was, of course, the Congress of African and Asian Writers. There was the Indian Film Festival of 1954. Tashkent was known for hosting these massive festivals. So I'm wondering how different this event, this one particular event, was from any number of events that happened in the same city with many of the same goals and probably the same thematic, that's the wrong word, but geographically placed attendees.
Thank you, Leora. Well, I think Rosen Jagalov's book From Internationalism to Postcolonialism offers, a kind of a snapshot, or at least some part of the answer to this question, specifically the relationship between the Afro-Asian Association of Writers that kind of culminated in the meeting, the Congress in 1958 in Tashkent, and then traveled also around the world, but occasionally sort of dipping it back to to Tashkent, as well as, of course, some of the other events that you mentioned. So the relationship between the Writers' Union and the Afro-Asian Writers Association and the film festival was very clear. I mean, it featured some of the same main protagonists. It was clear that it was conceived as an extension because, in fact, the 58 Writers' Conference had a film component, which sometimes is referred to as the first Tashkent Film Festivals of Asia and Africa in 58, and then was continued with the festivals of Afro-Asian Solidarity in Cairo and Jakarta. So, you know, they were really kind of all a very integrated network from the viewpoint of cultural bureaucracies. You know, there were some of, again, same figures, you know, let's say Chingiz Aytmatov obviously was everywhere, but really when you look at the role of the writers, right, it becomes its own particular kind of privileged area, but it was also not only the Soviet Union. There's a kind of a history that is unwritten about within the various post-colonial and post-revolutionary situations in which cinema really establishes a different relationship to the writers, both as members of the kind of ruling hegemonic construction of the national cultural heritage, national cultural identity, very often by providing scripts. And you have that, of course, very much in all of the cinemas of Central Asia. And that question of who writes the scripts and what language are the scripts written on, right, carries a lot of significance. So, you know, naturally, there was a kind of direct relationship. But, of course, film festivals have an additional infrastructural component, which makes them very different, which is you need prints. Right. I mean, writers associations, writers get together, you know, they read out loud, you know, I mean, of course, Soviet Union also had enormous translation sort of apparatus, right? So you do have the text also available. With films, we're also dealing with an actual material infrastructure of prints at the time, right, that had to be carried. And that actually opens up a whole other, again, sort of dimension to the organization of the festival, and again, sort of logistical issues of what prints could be brought by whom to where. And for example, one thing that really influenced then this festival is that because the prints were usually not available until pretty much the screening times of the event, because, you know, it was just logistically impossible to organize it ahead of time. Censorship was much weaker than it would have been, right? Because most of the Soviet officials making decisions about these films made them on the basis of a description. I mean, there are, especially as we go into the late 70s and 80s, some of the films were available to be seen ahead of time, but a lot of them were not, right? So that adds a different dimension just in how we think about, let's say, the Writers' Conference vis-a-vis the film events. But it's definitely a very interesting questions of how to think of these events in relation to each other.
May I just add quickly that what you're saying about not having the prints, the materials themselves until right before, you see this in radio all the time in the Soviet Union. I see this all the time in my own work. But we have a question from the audience. Who in the Central Committee of the CPSU supervised the festival? Perhaps there was a bureaucrat in Moscow and cultural circles that initiated ties to the Third World. As I understand, for political ties, it was Rostislav Ulyanovsky, the deputy director of the International Department of the CPSU. Did his name show up?
No, I actually have not seen his name because the cinema, I mean, I'm also not claiming to have seen all the official correspondence that was going on, right? But one of the strange things about a festival like that is basically, first of all, the contacts, international contexts with the capitalist world vis-a-vis the Third World or the developing countries, as they were referred to, had different levels of priority. And in fact, even though, of course, everything was to various degrees supervised by the Communist Party from Moscow, but there was an agreement, and actually Masha Kirasirova writes about it quite a lot in her recent book, to really delegate a lot of the political on the ground policy making power when it comes to cultural exchanges to the leaders of the Communist Party in the republics. So it was actually mostly the heads of the various committees, obviously all within the Communist Party, but largely within, especially Uzbekistan, but also to some degree, Tajikistan and Kazakhstan, that really were the decision makers. So there were crossover figures who were diplomats, official diplomats who were also participating in the festival and its organization, but they were all from Uzbekistan. And then, of course, there was the cinema. There was the festivals were actually technically part of the union of filmmakers. So it was a different, but of course there was a special committee within the Sovkino, the Soviet Film Committee, that made the big decisions. But again, in terms of making specific contacts with specific filmmakers, or very often it was done through the diplomatic corps, there would be a list of delegates who would be going to solicit works in the very beginning. And I write about it to some extent, and Rosen actually has a whole section in his book that describes that in greater details. But it was done differently, and the figures who were in charge of it were different depending on what area of the world, like specific countries, sort of who was on whose list. And then those contacts were officiated. But again, it was handed down to the, much more, again, Republican based figures. Not entirely, certainly. And of course, there was an oversight, but it really was not just like the one head of, one specific committee in Moscow who was in charge of it.
Great, thank you so much. I don't have other questions yet, but I'll ask another one of my own. And I'm wondering what was Central Asian about this festival and what was Soviet about this festival? And the reason I ask this is because I don't mean that in terms of the geographic location and the baggage that comes with it. And baggage is not the right terms, but maybe the connotations that come with the location, right? Tashkent means the developing world, blah, blah, blah. I mean more the aspects that you mentioned, like in the book, you mentioned the prevalence of spontaneous dance, right? Or the notion of informality that I think would be more present at a Central Asian festival, or a festival in Central Asia, than an analogous festival in Moscow. So I'm wondering if you noticed any other specifically Central Asian elements about this festival. And then conversely, what was Soviet about it, right? Other than maybe when I would think of a Soviet festival, I would think of more censorship, right? But there isn't that, as you just mentioned. Obviously, yes, there's a focus on the anti-colonial, but what else made it specifically Soviet?
Right. And this is where actually there was a kind of a strategic, obviously, positioning at play. So the idea of the spirit of Tashkent as a Central Asian festival that really came with, what really now looks like, let's say, essentialist, very politically also dubious kind of assumptions about what constitutes Asian hospitality, for example. But they were very much kind of embraced and at play. So, very often the organizers and guests talk about the spirit of the East, Duh Vostoka, right? And this comes up over and over again. And so that becomes as a way to frame, but also very often to justify precisely the deviation from the socialist, Soviet kind of protocols that would be at place. So one very specific example is that even though Officially, this was still not allowed, but this was happening at every edition of the festival. There were parties at the houses of the directors and organizers that went all night, to which, the different delegations were invited. Very often it was the Japanese and the Indian delegations that were sort of the most sought after, and kind of these events, which of course would never have taken place at the Moscow Film Festival, because the separation between the kind of where the international guests could stay, what they could see, and the private lives of the Soviet organizers or participants, in Moscow were really, really observed very, very strictly, and deviations were not tolerated. In Tashkent, in a way, constantly it was justified through this rhetoric. Well, we have to show the Eastern hospitality. How could we not show the Eastern hospitality and then not invite people over to our house? And sometimes it was done in direct, actually, violation of the KGB rules. Other times it was done sort of around them, and there, these recollections about, how there were a lot of volunteers in the festival, how they got around taking the guests to places that they weren't supposed to take, and kind of bypassing the KGB observers, who were, of course, there, like as they were everywhere, right? And so, but that was the understanding, that it was precisely what Silan Chen writes about, right? It's the music, it's the dance, it's the food, drinks too, even though I'm not sure that could be technically chucked off as a part of Eastern hospitality, right? But there was really a sense of kind of overflowing of these forms of sociability that are more kind of associated with sometimes domestic culture and private sphere, not just the official receptions. And of course, on the Soviet side, they were speeches. The speeches were absolutely, there, and you go through the transcripts and the records, and that's very, there's of course a formula that was applied, and the head of the Communist Party and the head of the Ministry of Culture would give the opening speeches. There would be the address from Brezhnev sent, read out loud, right? So there were, the kind of protocols were observed, but in between, right, there was definitely a lot more kind of spontaneous understanding of this as a festival, as a celebration, right? And in that sense, it was also very different, not just from the Soviet festivals, but from most festivals in Europe and North America, right? Where it was really treated as a kind of, again, a celebration, as a holiday, a festival in that sense, of festivities and people just, having a good time through, very often, again, music and dance and eating and drinking.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I don't see any other questions, to my bewilderment, in the Q&A box or the chat. And I don't want to keep people captive, especially you, Professor Salazkina. So if I don't see anything appear in the next 30 seconds, I think we will forever hold our peace. Is there anything else that you'd like to add for all of us to remember about the film festival? Kind of a final thought?
I just invite you to go and look, maybe look at Destination Tashkent, which is a collection of very, very short essays, but that also includes a lot of interviews with various, both people, Ali Khamraev, a lot of several, at least, Uzbek filmmakers who were part of the festivals, but also the more contemporary artists, both from Uzbekistan and from the rest of the world, kind of reflecting on that history. So I really urge you to take a look at that. And the book, again, is an open access, so you can easily download it. And it was nice to have a chance to share this with you.
Thank you so much for coming on this Zoom call and talking to us about your book. I certainly enjoyed hearing about it, and I think that everyone else did too. And with that, we sign off.